controversies, but perhaps the most alarming is its nuclear progress. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said earlier this year that Tehran could have fissile material for a bomb in less than 2 weeks and a nuclear weapon just a few months later. Last weekend, the IAEA said Iran has decided to bar several of its inspectors. Tehran has now removed, the technical term is de-designated, about 1/3 of the agency's most experienced inspectors who were working in Iran. The IAEA director condemned the act and said it severely affects the agency's ability to do its work. He asked Tehran to reconsider. Here's more of my interview with President Raisi. Let me ask you about the issues that the IAEA has raised about Iran recently. Would it be possible to get the IAEA inspectors to the point where they have enough people there who can actually inspect, or is your intention to make it impossible for the IAEA to function in Iran?
ببینید اگه ما می‌خواستیم که آژانس بازرسی نکنه
Well, you see, if our intention was for the IAEA not to be able to conduct inspections, we would have said so clearly. However, from the very beginning, our aim was to collaborate and cooperate with the IAEA. And they are fully aware of this within the IAEA, that we have cooperated fully. And this cooperation takes place in two ways.
انواع مختلف. یکی
In various ways. One, via installation of cameras that record in real time the activities that take place. Secondly, are the inspectors
نظارت بکنن
who come there and oversee the nuclear activities in Iran. And in the time that has elapsed thus far, since the agreement, 15 different times the IAEA has said and certified that there are no digressions into any type of Iran's nuclear activity, and that it remains purely for civilian and peaceful purposes. And we have announced time and time again that the use of nuclear weapons, the use of weapons of mass destruction in general, do not have a place. Why? Because we don't believe in it, nor do we have a need for it. However, what we believe in, given in particular the fatwa issued by His Eminence the Supreme Leader, because these are weapons of mass destructions and they can lead to the death of many innocent lives throughout the world, then it is haram, not religiously allowed to develop or use these weapons. We have, the Islamic Republic of Iran hasn't said we do not wish any inspectors to be here. We have said what these three countries, what has been said by the IAEA is that we have certain considerations vis-a-vis individuals from these three countries. Their trust is under a shadow of doubt.
Well, you have de-designated all American inspectors, of course. Now you are de-designating, which means essentially firing all the French and the German and the British ones. And the IAEA says this will cripple its ability to do the inspections. The IAEA does say there are many unanswered questions, and I want to raise them because those are the very questions that these three countries asked that you referred to. And the question is essentially around two sites which were never declared by Iran as nuclear sites, and yet the IAEA believes that there are traces of uranium there. Why would you not answer that question? Were those sites part of a uranium enrichment facility, and if so, why were they never declared?
سوالاتی که تا کنون داشتن توسط سازمان انرژی اتمی پاسخ داده شده.
All of their questions have been answered. Whether there were questions that were in any given specific time frame or those that are generally posed. Each time when we responded to these questions, we did so officially in official meetings with IAEA officials, and they were clarified. Any unanswered questions or ambiguities were clarified, so the misunderstandings that or lack of goodwill that exist, they're not founded in reality. They're simply allegations.
I have to say the IAEA does say that these are important questions that have not been answered relating to these two sites. So they regard these as serious unanswered questions. But let me ask you one that's very simple. Iran is the only country that has only a civilian program, as you claim it is, that enriches to the level you enrich, to 60% and higher. Why are you enriching to these high numbers? Doesn't that raise people's suspicion?
ببینید
You see,
اقدام ایران
this action of the Islamic Republic of Iran against the breaking of commitments and the three European countries vis-a-vis the reached accord. In the beginning, we were not seeking 60% levels of enrichment. They trampled upon their commitments according to multiple IAEA certifications. What the Islamic Republic of Iran did was in response to a breaking of commitment of the signatories to the agreement. And it was officially announced that the action that we intend to take is not intended to reach nuclear weapons of any type or a military dimension of any type, but it is a response for the lack of commitment demonstrated by the Europeans. And should they at any time return to a fulfillment of their commitments, rest assured and have no doubt that the Islamic Republic, as it has done in the past, will fully adhere to her commitments.
Next on GPS, I asked President Raisi about warming relations between some of Iran's Arab neighbors and Israel. How does he feel about this trend?
There's a path right where you are. Now insert the cargo.
Move on, move on.
Move on. Here you go.
Arab countries
Back up.
The great regional issue going on in the Middle East right now is, of course, what has been started with the Abraham Accords, the normalization of relations between some Gulf states and Israel. An Arab diplomat, a friend of mine, said the Iranians have managed to achieve the impossible, which is they have brought Israel and the Arabs together against them. Isn't the Abraham Accords fundamentally a failure of Iran's foreign policy? Because here you have Israel and countries that would not even recognize it, would not even talk to it, coming together, largely because they worry about Iran's influence in the region, which they see as malevolent.
بله این کار امریکایی‌ها بود که دست اسرائیل
This was a job done by the Americans to take the hands of the Israelis and put that squarely in the hands of certain Arab countries. This doesn't equal the acceptance of those nations, of those people. People in those countries, in those Persian Gulf Arab countries, have a great deal of hate for the Israeli actions. And this was only obtained under American pressure. And the frame of thought of the Americans was that they are somehow creating security for the Zionist regime, whereas normalization of certain countries with Israel does not buy security or bring about security for the Zionist regime, because both the Zionist regime is facing internal strife and difficulties, and it is hated outside, whether by countries that are of Muslim faith or otherwise. Across the world today, know that the Zionist regime is the most hated for crimes against humanity, against human beings, and the trampling upon of many agreements that it should have adhered to thus far. And it is hated for that. So this was the action undertaken by the Americans. On one side, the Americans did this. On the other side, they started to promote a phobia about Iran, an unfounded fear in the hearts of the neighboring countries about Iran. So that when they wish to establish contact with Iran or have an approach or rapprochement, or conduct economic activities with Iran, they see that these are fears created by the Americans. So this normalization will see no success, just like in previous cases. And this is not a solution for the Zionist regime. After 7.5 decades, they must go back to the principle founded in giving the rights to the Palestinian people that they are owed, what is rightfully theirs. The path must start from that point of origin. Instead of addressing the core issue, they are trying to bring about a forced normalization, which cannot help the Zionist regime in any way, shape, or form, other than to put everyone in a position where even the people of these nations that you touched upon earlier, they see that establishment of normalization of relationship as a betrayal of their principles and values. So after 75 years, these different avenues pursued by the United States of America have never responded, have never yielded the desired fruit.
You say that Israel is, after 75 years, has not solved its problems and is in trouble, but when I look at Israel, it seems to have become one of the richest countries in the region. It is now almost an industrial country by per capita GDP. It has built an extraordinary technology sector. And despite the Palestinian problem, they have been able to normalize relations with many Arab countries. Increasingly, it seems possible that they will normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, Iran is isolated. Your GDP growth has been very poor over the last 30 years. A country that used to be one of the richest countries in the region now looks backward in comparison. Iran seems more isolated. Is it worth the price you have paid to have taken all these positions that you will have taken? It feels like for the Iranian people, they have paid a heavy price in terms of lack of development.
With the Islamic Revolution, we gave a loud and clear announcement that we will not go under the hegemony of the West or that of America. We wish to be an independent country. We wish to have relations with all countries. But they sought only hegemony. Now, what conditions are in the region? Let's look at it. In the situation brought about by the Americans in Syria, was Syria successful or America? Certainly Syria. In Afghanistan, were the people of Afghanistan successful or the United States of America? Certainly the people of Afghanistan. In Iraq, were the Iraqis successful or the United States of America? Certainly the Iraqis. Now, where in the region has America been successful? You cannot see an example of her success anywhere in the region. The difference and the comparison between Iran, Western countries, and the Americans, Iran has been the one who has succeeded. Now, America also, it's important to keep in mind, that wanted for Iran to become isolated. That did not occur. Is the entire world comprised of 3 European countries and the United States of America? The world has almost 200 different independent countries. We have relations with a great many of them, most of them. Is today's world scenario showing you that American power is precipitating or that of Iran? We believe that it's certainly that of the United States of America, and Iran's position is being strengthened by the day.
Mr. President, our time is up, and I thank you for allowing the world to hear your views on a range of issues.
I also thank you.
Next on GPS, there is growing global rhetoric against free trade as countries like the United States have turned inward somewhat. I will talk to the head of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, about why this is so troubling.
As concerns for the environment.
Why this is so troubling. It's got to do with stability.
We have built something that is really wonderful.
And as far as what that Iranian guy just got through talking about, you can take it with a grain of salt, as far as I'm concerned, about his promises and about his criticism towards how that we have approached that situation. That has been a very, very delicate situation from the get-go because of so many enemies over there being against one another, and because of the statements that has been made by various enemies that would jeopardize the global society if we just automatically took everything for granted, that what that they was telling us was the truth, and then to come to find out it was nothing more than a manipulation tactic. We are living in such times like we've never ever began to imagine, with us being so socially connected with one country versus another. And it doesn't have to be a country that's right here on top of us or below us pertaining to our neighboring country, but now the global society is so much more valuable, because what goes on the other side of the planet can affect and will affect towards what goes on here. So let's listen to this. I feel like it would kind of be very interesting in hearing what they have to say.
There. Pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Farid.
So you've held so many fascinating jobs. You were finance minister of Nigeria, and in that whole period, for decades and decades, when you were a developmental economist, what would Washington tell you when they were trying to tell you guys in the third world and the developing world to change your policies?
Well, we all agreed, and we would hear, even when I was at the World Bank as well, we preached the same, that open markets, open, stable, fair, and transparent markets, and a multilateral trading system that was predictable was the best thing for the world. That interdependence would be the way to go. Not over-dependence, but interdependence would bring peace and prosperity to the world, and that developing countries should maintain these open markets.
So while the United States has been preaching this for the last 50, 75 years, in the last few years, it's the US under Trump that's put tariffs on not just the Chinese, but the Europeans, the Canadians. Biden has put Buy America provisions in all his bills. So the US has, in some ways, turned its back on its own creation.
Well, I would not say completely, but I want to stress that the more we put across measures that do not allow others, especially developing countries, to compete, the more we give the signal that the multilateral trading system is not an avenue that they can use to improve the living standards of their population, to fight poverty, and even to support sustainable development, all of which are the purposes for the World Trade Organization. We want to make sure that developing countries see they have a fair chance to compete within this system.
You make a very interesting point in your foreign affairs piece that everybody thinks about the vulnerabilities of your supplies during the pandemic, but moving to a system that is just based on a few friendly suppliers is actually, in some ways, leaves you more vulnerable.
I would like to stress that Farid. I think that given what we're seeing with climate change, the unpredictability of what is happening, concentrating production either at home or with a few friends may not build the resilience you want. Let us deconcentrate those and diversify supply chains to countries, those who were not part of globalization in the first round, but who are ready to receive investment. And many of these are developing countries. Vietnam is good, Indonesia is good, there's also Bangladesh.
And what you're saying, what really will give you security is if there's a global supply chain with many different manufacturers, so that if there's a typhoon in one place, you can go somewhere else.
Absolutely, and in critical sectors, we really need to look at this. Rare earths and minerals. We now can look and say, where else in the world can we develop this supply chain? In Africa, for instance, there's a golden opportunity to really diversify and develop the supply chain of these rare earths and minerals there, process them in place, create jobs for young people at the same time as you help manage the decarbonization of the world. It's like a win-win.
Now, a lot of people will say, free trade is all very good, well and good, but the Chinese, for example, manipulate the system. They have a massive state. It subsidizes, there are hidden subsidies, there are explicit subsidies. It doesn't open its market to lots of Western goods. Western tech companies can barely operate in China. How can they be part of a system and it's still open and fair?
There are countries that complain that China has hidden industrial subsidies. And we certainly need to be mindful of that because we want a level playing field. China itself complains about agricultural subsidies in other countries. So there are complaints on all sides. And I think what we need to do is remind ourselves of how this system was built. It is true that if we do not have a transparent system where there is a trust, then you have a race to the bottom because everyone will try to subsidize. And you know, developing countries will lose the most because they don't have the fiscal space to be able to join this subsidy race. So what we want is there are subsidies that are good. You subsidize research and innovation. Why not? That can help the world. But I think specific subsidies or specific requirements that make it problematic for other members to compete and issue. And that's what we want to get away with.
But it's fair to say that what happens in Washington matters the most. And if the U.S. turns toward protectionism and industrial policy, I think everyone else will just follow suit, right? They'll copycat.
Well, that will happen once one nation starts to subsidize, whether it's US, EU, China, or others will want to do that. But that's why we're saying that a subsidy race to the bottom is not the right way to go. I do want to say that, what we've been hearing from the US at the WTO is increasingly very supportive, and we hope we can push in that direction. I think there's a realization that this system we have, if we allow it to fragment, if we become too protectionist, we might lose it. And that is not what we want to do. We want to maintain the system that has served the world so well for so long.
Ngozi, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
Next on GPS, something completely different. We will tell you about a blockbuster movie in China, its version of Top Gun, but it's all about America's bullying ways.
Wow.
Welcome to
Unbelievable.
That's with a gag order. And this is what I expect to see in the defense's response. A gag order or prior restraint is something that is very constitutionally suspect. In fact, historically,
This right here, what's going on, is absolutely draining all the oxygen out of the room to the degree that our United States media stays focused on Donald Trump and Donald Trump's so-called rigged election that he was lying to the American people over, our stolen election. This has taken so much oxygen out of the room that now our media don't have no more airtime to discuss anything else other than Trump, 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 Trump. Plus, it's taking away our resources and our thoughts and our energy and our goodwill in trying to solve probably 1,000 other different problems that are just as important, if not more important, than what has happened in the past. These are up to the courts to decide. And how they decide and what they decide will be up to them. In the meantime, our federal tax dollars that pays for all this should be focused upon the problems either at hand or the problems that's fixing to come into hand pertaining to affecting not thousands but millions of people's lives. That is the reason why I continue to say that this is nothing more than a distraction. It is a distraction in taking us, we the people, away from the areas that we should be applying our thoughts and our time towards. That's basically like a diversion. It's a diversion to where if you're going to rob the bank on one end of town, you start a fire on the opposite end of town. That way everybody is running towards the fire. That way you can run to the bank while everybody's running to the fire on the opposite end of the town. It's an old strategy that has been fumigated for probably thousands of years since mankind trying to outsmart either a person or a group of people. And I continue to keep saying that, and it continues to keep going in one ear and out the other. So nanny boo boo is the only thing that is left for me to be able to say whenever these excursions continue to multiply and get worse and worse and worse, is as in, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so. You wouldn't listen. You would not listen. You had to learn your lesson the obvious hard way, to where you could have retreated, you could have reformed, and you could have made it much, much simpler and easier on not only yourself, but upon those constituents that you represent and for the people in general.
Historically, gag orders on the press are almost always invalidated. They're on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is gagging attorneys like me. That's comparably very easy because we're officers of the court. We've sort of consented to the court imposing rules on us. Somewhere in the middle is a participant like Trump, who has constitutional rights, but the local rules in D.C. allow for this. And in addition, D.C. uses a test, an easier test, called a substantial likelihood test. If it's substantially likely that his statements could materially affect the case, then a gag order may be warranted. Other jurisdictions use a clear and present danger type test, but in this case, applying the substantial likelihood, if you're betting on it, the odds are that the judge will impose a limited gag order, and that's all.
Once more, what do we have to blame for this? Let's go back to the core of origin of how come this has been so substantiating in our lives. Okay? You think maybe it's got to do with human communications? You think it's got to do with AI? You think it's got to do with all the gizmos and gadgets towards everybody now being so intricately connected? Sure it does. Sure it does. And I use this very example that he's talking about right here towards everybody knowing how effective that somebody like Donald Trump can get out into the eyes of the public and probably persuade to some degree or dissuade, whichever way you want to look at it, similar towards what went on with the Oklahoma bombing. The Oklahoma bombing was so wide and broad towards being on international, national news almost every day for probably, I don't know, probably almost as long as it was 9/11. That they had to reach out and go plumb to Denver, Colorado and find a group of people over there that wasn't biased about the Oklahoma bombing. But even by them going all the way over there, and this was in 1995, you know as well as I do, all you had to have was a home computer and you could look up any and everything that you wanted to look up pertaining to the Oklahoma bombing that would have a profound effect upon people's decisions towards being in the courts pertaining to a jury trial. What they're trying to do is virtually impossible with artificial intelligence being as predominant and as strong as what it is today. And it goes back into the reflection of what I've said before, that I don't know if anybody's paid any attention to, pertaining to double jeopardy. It's supposed to be the American law that you cannot be tried and convicted of the same crime after you've already been tried and convicted of the crime the first time. But because AI has sneaked up into everybody's life, and it's basically now in everybody's living room, it's in everybody's bedroom, it's in everybody's life, right in their very face, it's almost impossible that if a person does go out and makes a boo-boo whenever they was a teenager, or they just happen to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing with the wrong group of people at the wrong time. They was influenced in the wrong way. And now the chilling thought of that haunting them, tormenting them, and basically punishing them for the rest of their lives, day in, day out, endless, regardless whether you're in one state or the other, because you can't run from the computer. I tried to do that myself pertaining to the incident that occurred in my life out in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma in 2009, whenever I was investigating them down there, bringing the investigation with Waco pertaining to Mount Carmel, pulling both of them together. There was not a state that I could go to in the auto body industry, regardless whether I was working for a backyard Julio or working for a strong independent or a franchise dealership. I could not go nowhere without those exchanges haunting me and causing irreversible damages in my life, to the point that it basically ruined my life. It literally ruined my life because of all the lies and deceit that was put out there on the computer. I could not go to some of the most hidden, devastating areas that you would think, well, because everybody else is off the grid, maybe I'll be off the grid. No. It don't work that way. You get pulled over one time, they run your name, and now all of a sudden there's a whole bank of stuff that comes up. And the thing about it is, the unprofessional world has become so unprofessional that you really can't tell the difference of whether or not it's really being promoted by the courts and what they're putting out there about that particular individual, or whether or not it's just hearsay. That's how confusing that artificial intelligence has become, that is literally destroying people's lives, including my own. Because if you continue to badger people and to tell people again and again and again, this person's a bad person, this person's a bad person, this person's evil, this person's mean, this person's a monster. If you continue to do that again and again and again, it will eventually start sinking into the wide view of the audience pertaining to the masses, and the next thing you know, everybody is convinced that you're the Antichrist. Everybody is convinced that instead of you being on the white horse, you're on the black horse. Everybody is convinced that this individual has some sort of a deep, dark, hidden mental illness of some sort pertaining to destroying his character. I had no idea how strong that the forces was out there in becoming public until after I become public. Whenever you become public, you're basically in public domain. And that's one of the reasons why that I film what I film. Probably 85 to 90% of the stuff that I film is on open domain circuitry pertaining to news. And as the news is being broadcasted, it gives me an opportunity to be able to voice my opinion either about the subject matter that they're talking about, or it gives me an opportunity to use my personal stories for an example of that in which what has occurred in the past. So in one way, it's a good thing pertaining to social media, because I'm now weaponizing it for the benefit of being able to tell my story that hopefully I'll be vindicated one day because of. But it was the very thing that I'm using right now, social media platform, artificial intelligence, that literally was destroying my life even after I moved back to Northwest Tennessee, that I was hoping that there would be at least somebody in the area that wouldn't have been fed into all these lies, that would have believed all this stuff. But from my understanding, they're all still convinced that Juby is the Antichrist, that Juby is the one on the black horse instead of the white horse, that Juby, the individual talking to you right now, is the one with some sort of a hidden mental illness.
And once that gets fumigated in a person's life, regardless whether it's a he or she, it's the next thing to impossible to getting it out. But yet now our laws say, well, you can't continue to convict somebody again and again and again for the same crime pertaining to double jeopardy. So you can't tell me that artificial intelligence pertaining to social media has not fumigated a energy or an entity of itself to the point that now if you make a mistake, it'll haunt you the rest of your life. It don't matter if it was jaywalking. It don't matter if it was a speeding ticket. It don't matter if you was late on a payment. It don't matter if you done something incredibly, horribly wrong or bad. It don't matter if you paid for your crime that you're not supposed to have to pay again and again and again the rest of your life. But that's what's happened because of artificial intelligence. So I just wanted to clarify that as you're listening to this particular program here about, yes, Donald J. Trump.
Government is asking for. Very good strategy by them. They're coming in reasonable. They're coming in basically saying, look, we respect his rights to speak. We're only looking for him to not talk about the judge, about the government, about the U.S. attorneys, and limit it to that. Otherwise, he's free to speak about his innocence.
Right, because he's already precluded from talking about sensitive matters, so this might just move the needle.
That would be like taking a race car driver and telling him that he's to never ever talk about race car driving. That would be like taking somebody that was a business consultant and telling them, now you're not never ever supposed to mention anything about business. Or telling a minister or a preacher or a priest, now don't never ever mention God or anything pertaining to spirituality issues pertaining to religion. What they're asking is literally impossible in today's society, especially with artificial intelligence being in everybody's face. Besides that, if you're a race car driver, you're going to have a tendency to talking about race cars. If you're a football player, you're going to have a tendency of talking about sports. Get real. Get real in what these people are talking about. And we have artificial intelligence to blame for this. Even by them taking the case of the Oklahoma bombing all the way to Colorado. Denver, Colorado, I think it was. Do you not think that those people was already aware of the Oklahoma bombing? You could have probably taken that case and moved it to Alaska. And there would still be primitive areas that would have known about the Oklahoma bombing. That would be like taking 9/11 and saying, well, let's go somewhere where had nobody never heard of 9/11. You'd probably have to go down into the Amazon forest somewhere down in South America to ask people, hey man, did you hear about them Twin Towers being attacked and killing almost 3,000 people? Did you hear about 9/11? Odds are they probably have. All the way down in the forest. Get real.
A little further. All right, before we let you go, another big headline from ABC News and New York Times. Reporting on the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case says that Trump, after learning the FBI wanted to talk to his former assistant, declared to her, quote, "You don't know anything about the boxes." According to the indictment, though, she took direct action related to them. Now, NBC News hasn't confirmed this quote, and Trump's spokesperson said he did nothing wrong. But how do those details factor in?
This reporting about Molly Michael, one of Trump's former aides, may make her one of the most appetizing witnesses for the government in that case related to the Mar-a-Lago documents, because, as we were just talking about before, she's somebody that reportedly came back in after the subpoena or after the search warrant was executed and reportedly found documents in her desk and came forward and said, hey, you guys forgot something. These are people that the government loves. They don't get them very often. In most criminal cases, the government has people coming in to testify against the defendant who used to be his or her co-conspirator, who are also bad people with baggage of their own. That's not this person. That's not Molly Michael. This is an ideal witness for the government if they want to call a witness to show that Trump had knowledge, that had the willfulness and the desire to avoid being caught.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Danny Savalas, thank you.
I want to know what his motives was towards the reason why he done what he done. I would like to hear, coming out of Donald J. Trump's mouth, since we're talking about Donald J. Trump here taking up this oxygen, I would like to hear what his concerning concepts was about taking those documents. Was it for the benefit and the good of we the people? Was it for the benefit and the good of himself? Was he going to squander towards going in behind people's backs the way that he did towards basically blackmailing or trying to blackmail the Ukrainians? Even after he spoke well of Putin, after Putin went to war with the Ukrainians, towards what kind of a genius that Putin was? We need to find out what is making Donald J. Trump tick from within. And we need to hear it coming from his mouth, in people seeing his expressions, hearing the tone of his voice, and understanding, making a rational decision of their own. You can call it judging if you want to. It's opinionated, whatever word you want to use. That way people can make their own decisions, and rather not it was a big hoax, a bluff coming from Donald Trump, or if Donald Trump actually had reasonable excuses towards him doing what he done, especially based upon his contradictory replies, such as telling the American people that the American people still have not gotten down to the bottom of 9/11. But then he'll deviate from that method and go over to another method towards saying how enlightening and inspiring the Saudis was during the time that he was over there putting his hand on a little crystal ball. The American people are tired of getting all these different reports, putting out all these different factors, especially whenever the same person says one thing and then contradicts himself in the same sentence. It's become confusing. I want to say one more other thing before I end this, pertaining to the shutting down of the government. To me, shutting down of the government is the same thing as the little boy that cried wolf. He cried wolf, he cried wolf, he kept crying wolf, till eventually the people caught on to this little boy that cried wolf, until one day there really was a wolf, and one day the wolf really did consume the little boy. The people felt bad about the fact that they did not save the little boy that cried wolf. But in reality, whose fault was it? It was the little boy that kept crying wolf, because he was being misleading. He was being confusing. He was contradicting himself in the sense of the importance of him crying wolf. The same thing with the United States federal government pertaining to it shutting down. One day, with us being $30+ trillion, puts us that much more closer towards, in reality, one day their cry towards crying wolf is actually going to turn into a real wolf. In other words, one day the government really will shut down. And whenever it does, it'll cause chaos. And I tend to wonder that that's the strategy that they're playing on the American people, towards making it so confusing that the American people really don't know to believe them or not. But then one day, whenever it does occur, who is at fault that created this atmosphere that has caught the American people unaware, or caught the American people blindsided? It's our politicians. It's our politicians that was not upfront, that did not tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So help them God. But yet no, these are the things that they preach in our courts. But yet no, there for a while, and I don't know if it still is, towards taking God completely out of the equation in in the very one that created the design of truth, that now our government requires for its citizens to tell the truth, but they themselves are not willing to live by their own rules. If that's not contradictory, if that's not hypocrisy, I will kiss your tail and give you 30 minutes to go out here and draw up a crowd. Because that's exactly what it is. It goes back to the old cliche, do as I say and not as I do. Well, that's the very things that Jesus Christ taught for us not to do. Once more, how can we depend upon a government that claims that it's in the better interest of its own people towards controlling different factors about our lives whenever they can't even control the factors within their own lives? They can't even protect themselves, much less the American people. When is the American people going to wake up to these manipulating tactics that is now been going on for quite some times? I don't forgot now that the original terminology that it's called whenever you hype up something. That basically all this stuff about Donald J. Trump is past tense. It should be handled in the courts. It shouldn't be handled in our media this way. The only thing that I'm concerned about is hearing what Donald J. Trump has to say about his motives of why he took the records to begin with. And whenever he speaks, he better be very, very convincing in what he's saying, because people like myself are going to be able to read through him of whether or not he's lying again, intentionally, or just by chance, maybe he's telling the truth. Good luck to all of us on this particular Sunday, September, I think it's the 22nd, 23rd, year 2023. God bless America, God bless our troops, and heaven help us all.